Mexico Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a city of canals and causeways, the Venice of the New World. Tenochtitlan, located on Lake Texcoco, one of 5 lakes in the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan. In 1500, it was perhaps one of the largest cities in the world. A clean city, much to the amazement of the arriving Spaniards, for the cities of 16th century Europe were dirty, with plague-carrying sewage running through the streets. Not so Tenochtitlan. Today, nearly 500 years later, little remains of the Aztec capital. Built atop its ruins is a thriving metropolis, Mexico City. And little remains of the 5 lakes, thanks to the erosion of floods and droughts and to human effort. For in 1607, European engineers diverted the water of Lake Texcoco into the Panuco River. The Spaniards, with little regard for the life-giving water, saw the lakes as unattractive swamps to be systematically drained. Only Xochimilco, the floating gardens, reminds us of the past as it must have been. Today at Xochimilco, flowers grow on platforms of earth and aquatic plants called chinampas. We may think of them as pleasant tourist attractions, but in Aztec times, the chinampas were the major source of food for Tenochtitlan. The city of Tenochtitlan needed vast amounts of food to feed its large population. The chinampas offered a unique solution to the problem of feeding the city. They could yield up to 3 harvests a year of life-giving corn and other crops out of what normally would have been an unproductive swamp. Transport was almost non-existent in Mexico because there were no large animals like oxen or horses to pull vehicles. Food could not be brought into Tenochtitlan from other regions of Mexico. Situated as it was on an island linked to the mainland by causeways, the city thus solved its food problem by intensive cultivation of what other societies would have considered wasteland. Scattered throughout Mexico, we see other reminders of Aztec might, the ruins of Tenochtitlan. And in this lesson, we're going to look at the people who made up the Aztec state. Unlike the earlier societies of Mexico, we know quite a lot about the Aztecs. Their history and their way of life have been preserved for us in picture books called codices. Here you see a page from a codex. In the years following the Spanish conquest of Mexico, the codices were drawn by careful Indian artists who wanted to preserve their heritage. We'll use some of the codex pictures to show their religion, how the people of Aztec Mexico lived, and other aspects of their society. Now, in theory, Aztec society in 1500 was completely democratic and the people were well off. Compare this to Europe in the same period. European countries were either ruled by autocratic governments or by weak feudal lords, and millions of peasants were starving every year. In Mexico, people starved only in periods of great famine, and people, no matter what their status, had certain rights and obligations to the society. Of course, there were classes of people in Mexico, just as there have been in all countries of the world. At the top level of the society was the nobility, the warriors, the ruling class. We can equate the Aztec nobility with the wealthy or powerful in any society. Their power was reflected in their homes, the fine palaces, the elaborate trappings of their position. People with less prestige lived in cruder homes. Theirs was the one-room, thatched roof adobe house without doors or windows and furnished with only a few straw mats and low wooden stools. Below the nobility in the social structure were the merchants. They exported the manufactured goods of Tenochtitlan and imported luxury items from distant cities. The merchants lived in constant danger, for in their travels they were frequently attacked by highway robbers, by people who thought they were spies, by competitive traders from other city-states. But trade was a lucrative business, and the merchants became wealthy, a fact they concealed from the jealous nobility. Below the merchants were craftsmen who supplied the goods that the home could not. Later in this lesson, we'll talk about some of their crafts. Most of their output went to the emperor and to the ceremonial centers. But some craftsmen did work in their homes. They supplied the merchants and small markets within the cities. The craftsmen enjoyed modest social standing. The common people were the largest class in Tenochtitlan. They were the workers and the farmers, the backbone of Aztec society. But they could move upward. If they had courage and intelligence and tenacity, they could become warriors or priests or craftsmen. But like everybody else, they had to serve as soldiers in time of war, and they had to pay taxes, usually in the form of communal labor. The lowest class of all were the slaves. They had no rights as citizens, but they had no obligations either. Slaves were owned as a piece of property, but they were well treated, housed, clothed, and fed. Slavery in Aztec Mexico was not an exacting state, and many poor people sold themselves into slavery to obtain food. A slave lost his eligibility for tribal office, but he retained many of his rights. He could still control his own family. He could own property and even other slaves. And the children of slaves were always free. This is in contrast to slavery in ancient Greece, Rome, and later the United States, where children of slave mothers usually were born into a life of slavery. Most important, slavery was a temporary thing. Slaves could and did buy their freedom. As free men, they returned to membership in one of the other social classes. Now, no matter what a person's class, every individual belonged to a family. The family was the basic unit of the society. It was the most important institution. The family was a source of protection for the young, a source of learning and moral teaching, a refuge in time of trouble, and it set a person's standard of conduct throughout his life. Every honor which a man sought was less for individual gain than to bring honor to his family by proving the value of his training in the home and his devotion to his parents. A man's family included not only parents and children, but aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. No one would consciously do anything that would bring dishonor to the family or to disobey the orders of the parents. Any failure of the individual was less a failure on his part than a reflection of the shortcomings of the family. The family itself was a member of a larger group of families called a kalpuyi. At the head of the kalpuyi was a chief. In English, we've translated kalpuyi to mean clan. But this suggests a blood relationship of all the people. More likely, it was something like a state, a part of a larger nation, a territorial entity, identified by the section of the city it occupied and the land it owned. In Mexico, private ownership of land was very rare. Each kalpuyi held land which was considered a gift of the gods. Fields were parceled out fairly depending upon the size of the family. If a farmer failed to cultivate his land for 3 years, it was returned to the communal lands. Even today, the people of Mexico believe that the land belongs to those who work it, and that everyone who wants to farm should have the opportunity. There was some private ownership of land. Warriors were given land grants in conquered territory in return for distinguished service, and some nobles owned private estates. Now, according to legend, 20 kalpuyi made up the Aztec tribe, and the chief of each kalpuyi was a member of the tribal council. 4 tribal officials were elected from this body. They served the emperor directly and were in charge of various aspects of administration. For example, Two of the officials acted as the supreme justices of the land. The emperors, such as Montezuma II, were appointed by the tribal council. He was always a member of a royal family which claimed its descent from the god Quetzalcoatl. But he was not an absolute ruler like contemporary kings in Europe. For instance, kings like Louis XIV of France were divine rulers. They believed their power came directly from God, and they could be overthrown only by violence, revolution. The Aztec rulers could be replaced without violence. If the tribal council agreed that an emperor was not doing his job well, its members did not hesitate to dethrone him and to proclaim another member of the family as ruler of Mexico. The emperor was the embodiment of the Aztec nation. It was he who stood between men and the gods. Because of his exalted position, he had to be protected from insult. His person was surrounded by rituals similar to that about the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. His feet could never touch the soil. He rode in a litter or walked on the capes of his subjects, which were thrown in his path. He could never eat from the same plate twice. Likewise, each item of his clothing was worn only once. In his presence, people were required to wear very plain clothing and never to look directly into the eyes of their ruler. A similar custom prevailed in Japan well into the 20th century. There was a considerable mystique surrounding the Aztec emperor, but he was a very remote figure to the average man and woman. What really controlled their lives, determined their actions, was religion. We talked about religion in the last lesson. Now let's see how it affected the Indians of Mexico. You'll remember that religion was based on nature worship, a sophisticated and complex religion. At the time of the Spanish conquest, there was a trend toward monotheism, toward the worship of a chief or supreme god, invisible and omnipresent. But the trend was not developed. Mexican religion had an elaborate hierarchy of gods and goddesses. These deities were the ultimate power over man. They controlled his crops, his health, every aspect of his life. And every family had a household altar where they worshiped a god or gods chosen for special adoration. Today, in a similar fashion, some Christians may choose certain saints for special attention in their prayers and in their homes.